Welcome back to the show. The Gathering for Justice is a not-for-profit that its mission is to end child incarceration as well as eliminate the racial inequities permeating the justice system. As President Biden and Mayor Adams recently met in New York City to discuss citywide gun violence as well as federal action, the Gathering for Justice calls upon these leaders to consider the impact of more policing on Black and Brown communities. Joining us now and sharing more is the Director of Youth Campaigns and Leadership at the Gathering for Justice, Luis Hernandez. And Luis, I'm glad to have you here with us on our forums, and great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Daren.
Let's go front and center. I mean, recently, President Biden made his way here to New York City. He talked with New York City Mayor Eric Adams about this very topic of gun violence and how we can combat gun violence. Give me your thoughts on, the president's visit and what you felt that meant for this conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's important to note that we're at a time right now that's different than any other. About a year ago, I had the honor of joining the president when he made his initial announcements on gun violence, and there hasn't been much since. And so for the president to come to New York amidst a time that gun violence, it's one of the most prevalent issues in society, I think that it shows an alignment between the federal government, the state, and the city in ways that we need it. However, the crux of it is that we're turning back to policies that we know don't work. And so I was a part of some of those meetings that occurred. I met Biden when he came to New York, and that's part of what I pressed. I think it's important to note that we need violence prevention strategies. We need solutions to this crisis. We need to end this epidemic of gun violence, but it doesn't come from criminal justice. It doesn't come from policing, and it doesn't come from systems that have failed our people over and over again. And so we know more than anything right now, what we need, it's things like the crisis management system that serves our communities, that is employed by people who live in our communities, who know our streets, who are former gang members, who understand the nuances of what it's like to be on the streets right now as a young person, as someone who's experiencing gun violence. And so we're calling on the president, we're calling on the mayor to pivot away from these strategies that they know too well does not work. We've had over policing, we've had these crews within the NYPD that roamed our streets and stop and frisked our young people and our community members for over a decade, and we've seen the results. It doesn't work. It leads to punitive measures and over incarceration in our communities.
Let's talk more specifically about that. As you talk about stop and frisk, it's something that I've spoken about. I really am not in favor of stop and frisk. I didn't see too many results myself. I found it to be more the other way around, that it does become more detrimental, particularly in our communities. We saw it enacted in years past, and we've even heard former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who even admitted that stop and frisk was not the best measure whatsoever, yet and still a path towards reinstatement by New York City Mayor Eric Adams to possibly see this back on the street, the impact of more policing happening here across New York City. But you do have concerns about stop and frisk. You do have concerns about possibly the potential of over policing and possibly more incarceration.
Absolutely, I think that's spot on here. We've seen what the mayor is calling a blueprint. We've analyzed it, and I think it's important to recognize both the good in it, but also recognize what's failed us. And so much of it that has failed us, it's because we've seen it before. Right? It's not an innovative approach. Police units jumping out in unidentified clothing, being unidentifiable on our streets does not make our community safer. I think we need to look at the stats. We need to understand the data. And what we know is that the safest communities are the communities that have an abundance of resources, are the communities that have community centers, are the communities that have thriving schools and a really powerful workforce that employs all type of people, whether or not they have an education. And I think that's where we need to move. We need to move towards serving community members who are in need of resources, creating opportunities for employment, creating opportunities for young people to be engaged in programs in and outside of schools. And we can't rely on police to do that for us. We can't police our way out of this epidemic of gun violence. We can't criminalize our way or prosecute our way out of these issues. It's going to result in a failed system. It's going to result in over policing. And we're going to see the phase two of Biden's crime bill, right? As Eric Adams talks about being the Biden from Brooklyn, what I see is 1994 Biden, crime bill Biden, the Biden that fueled mass incarceration across this country. And we cannot allow that to happen, not in New York and not in 2022.
I know there's a lot of concern in communities, particularly after the mayor and the president left. There was concern about police-community relations, already strained, already messed up, and how this could have a more traumatizing effect. Give us some insight into how this can be more traumatic, because even for you in your own personal life, I mean, you've had traumatic experience with your brother in regards to him having becoming a victim over policing. So first of all, share with us a little bit about that experience with your brother, and then lead into, and then you can continue talking about the trauma aspect.
Absolutely. There's a range of trauma. I think for many of us who grew up in these communities that were over policed, or were phasing out of over policing, we experienced the post-traumatic stress of that. We experienced the post-traumatic stress of being in facilities that are decaying. Folks who've been to Rikers, people like my brother, right, who was forced to spend over a year in Rikers Island for a crime he didn't commit. These are the type of things that people are enduring in our communities. And it starts with that initial contact with police, right? That initial arrest that leads to these ongoing proceedings that sometimes feel never ending. And I think so much of what we need to do in our communities falls back on the damage, the harm, the trauma that's been created, not just by police departments, but by a system that's failed us completely, right? We've seen former mayors fail us. We've seen former politicians be elected, run and be elected on campaigns calling for transformative justice, and they get into office and fail their communities once again. And so what we need to see to transform this pain is that investment in resources, right? My brother spent over a year in Rikers because of New York's terrible bail system, right? Cash bail was not something that we can continue to go back to. He was a 16-year-old teenager arrested at Rikers Island, being charged for crimes he didn't commit, and was facing a $250,000 bail. No family in the Bronx, no family from New York 15, the poorest congressional district in the nation, could afford a $250,000 bail. And so what you're telling folks like my family is that when you don't have the resources, because you don't have the money, you deserve to be locked up, right? It's a dual system, one that serves white and wealthy folks a different way, and Black and brown community members who don't have access to resources in a completely varying way. And that's the crux of the system that we need to combat. It starts with, again, that initial point of arrest, but it leads to things like bail. It leads to things like faulty discovery that not just produce mass incarceration, but take away the livelihood of young people and fuse what we see as generational trauma in our communities.
And this is your personal experience, because we do know the officer that was involved in the arrest of your brother was later caught in corruption.
That's right. That's right. The Detective David Terrell at the time, he was not just caught in corruption, but caught in a entire entanglement with the NYPD, where he was not just harassing women and children, but arresting folks in all different communities. He had been transferred from various other departments, had already experienced several lawsuits. And so it raises the question as well around qualified immunity, right? As well as how are we holding these systems accountable? Currently, there are no systems that thoroughly hold these systems to account, right? There's no overseeing department that can hold the NYPD accountable. We have a CCRB, but they don't have decision-making power. And so what does it look like to transform some of these things to allow oversight to exist, to allow us to shift to a place where not just community members are being held accountable, but everyone who creates harm, everyone who creates damage is being held to account for their actions. That's where we need to move. We can't just think about what's happening on our local community level. That's absolutely important. We need to address that. We need to address the harm. We need to pour resources into that. But we need to also address the harm that's coming from the top, right? The systems that continue to fail us, to over-policing, the harm and the trauma that's coming from an entire department that quite frankly has more funding than militaries around several countries in the globe.
Yeah. And so I want to take a moment and have you share a little bit about your organization. You're National Director of Youth Campaigns and leadership at Gathering for Justice. And for those who may not know about Gathering for Justice, tell us about your organization.
Absolutely. So the Gathering for Justice was founded in 2005 by legendary singer, songwriter, activist Harry Belafonte. After he witnessed a 5-year-old Black girl, Jaisha Scott, being handcuffed in her classroom. And so it's why our mission is to end child incarceration. We realize that policing in our schools and our communities for too long has led to the criminalization and adultification of not just Black girls, but Black and brown children across America. And so it's something that we uniquely experience in this world. As the director of youth campaigns and leadership, I'm looking to launch a campaign to end the war on children this year. And there's so much ahead for the Gathering for Justice. As an organization who's been not just rooted here in New York, but rooted in places like Alabama and California and so many others, we're doing work to transform the system from the inside out. And there's a lot to be done. We need the support of the community, but we also need folks to be held accountable throughout this process. And it's why we're not just fighting for these issues. We're really looking at a transformative approach to disrupting criminalization of young people in their schools, in their communities, and on our streets.
Talk to me about where you are in terms of optimism. Are you optimistic that things will get better in terms of criminal justice reform, policing, given the fact that New York City Mayor Eric Adams is a former and retired New York City Police senior brass? Are you optimistic that he has the mindset of community, or do you think that he will really draw down a little bit more on his law enforcement experience, which could be possibly more detrimental when it looks to the issue of over-policing?
Listen, I have to say that I'm not very optimistic that at the moment, but what I also know is that we're not even 100 days in. And so Adams and his entire administration has an opportunity to pivot away from punitive tactics that they know don't work. He ran on a campaign where he talked about bringing accountability to the NYPD. He ran on a story talking about his experience within the department and why he decided to become a police officer. And that's a story of accountability. That's a story of braveness. That's a story that many New Yorkers could resonate with. But we can't afford to have someone come into office and lead in an entirely different way. We can't afford fear mongering. We can't afford detrimental effects on policing and incarceration in our communities. And we know too well what does and doesn't work, right? These aren't things that are falling out of the sky. He's not innovating in any way. He's leaning on tactics that have failed us for generations. And so we're calling on him to shift that right now. He has an opportunity to roll back some of the things that he's done. And he has an opportunity to transformatively invest into the crisis management system and truly bring New York back to its heels, right? We're recognized across the country as the safest big city, right? But it doesn't feel like that anymore. And so as mayor, he has the power to transform that. He has the power to invest in systems that work, invest in a cure violence initiative that can transform our approach to gun violence prevention, and also invest in the education and resources of young people who are being disproportionately impacted by the violence that we're seeing in our communities. And so while I'm not optimistic about the administration, I am optimistic about the young people who are leading the fight right now in New York, who are fighting back against these tactics and fear mongering that we're seeing in our city, and who are raising their voices in unparalleled ways. And so I call on the mayor to do better as much as he knows better, right? And I'm also calling on his administration to guide him in the right way. Who are the people that he's speaking to? Who are the people around him? Because what I do know is that it's not community members like mine. It's not people like myself. It's not folks who've been on these streets and understand the effects of policing and criminalization as well as I do.
Yeah. Well, before we go, I want to get an opportunity for some young people that may be watching, or you got some parents out there saying, listen, I want to get him connected, my son, my daughter, connected to an organization that's actually making a difference and doing some social justice work and creating social impact. How can people be a part of your organization?
Absolutely. So there's many ways in which young people specifically can be a part of our organization, but we are an intergenerational organization, so we welcome the entire community. There's many works in which we do. We have a volunteer task base task force here in New York, Justice League NYC. And so we invite you to apply and join that community. You can visit our website, www.gatheringforjustice.org. That's gathering, FOR, justice.org, to learn more about our programs and our work and sign up for our mailing list. And really, that's the best way in which you could plug into any programmatic activities that come up. We offer support to the community. We led a social justice initiative that really relied on mutual aid, where we were offering community-based grants, and are looking to bring that back in the coming months. And so we want to continue to support and work with the community as best we can. So again, visit www.gatheringforjustice.org or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at gather4justice.
Luis, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Great information. Got to have you back throughout the course of the year as we continue to take a look at the mayor, policing, and some of these initiatives, and seeing how they're pan out, and whether or not we can see any chart, any progress on that. Luis Hernandez, thank you so much for being with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Daren.
All right, brother. We'll talk to you soon. Listen, got to take a quick break. We'll be at more show here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll be back in a moment.